It's been 1 year since the world woke up to the war in Ukraine. Russia's full-scale invasion on February 24th, 2022 brought fear and suffering beyond the borders of the eastern Donbass region to all corners of the country and beyond. In this episode of CNA Correspondent, we examine how the war has changed the world and Ukraine itself. We begin here in Kyiv, where Sarah Coates has been taking a look at how a year of war has shaped the people that have lived through it.
This time last year, a sense of doom hung over Ukraine. The country was braced for an attack from Russia, but when the first strikes landed, they were still hard to process.
24 лютого, на жаль, для нас такий день був дуже тяжким. Можна так сказати, таких непорозуміннях. Ми не знали, що робити, чи нам речі складати. Ми не хотіли вірити, наш мозг це не сприймав, що почалася війна.
Nearly 1 year later, Hanna Tymoshenko is now one of millions of displaced Ukrainians. Their homes destroyed or too dangerous to return to. Others carry a different burden, that of occupation. In the early days of the conflict, Russia took control of several areas around Kyiv. That territory includes the defunct Chernobyl nuclear plant. Valery Semenov is an engineer there. His job is to ensure the facility remains secure. When the Russians arrived, he and dozens of his colleagues spent 35 days stuck under the watchful eye of soldiers.
Самое сложное было это эмоциональное состояние, конечно, нашего персонала контролировать. То, что, зная по себе, свое эмоциональное состояние, я даже не мог представить, а что другие. Тем более в разговорах с персоналом совсем, что люди готовы были к самым крайним действиям против агрессора, скажем так.
During that uncertain time, millions of Ukrainians left the country for safer ground. Many have resettled elsewhere in Europe, where they're allowed to remain for 3 years. But not all of them are prepared to wait that long. Many Ukrainians who fled to other countries as refugees at the beginning of this war are now returning home. They say they feel a moral obligation to be here, and being away was too difficult. School teacher Valentina Homenko is one of them. In March, she travelled to Berlin with a wave of other refugees. But Russian forces eventually abandoned their attempts to take Kyiv. The situation in the capital stabilized, and Homenko decided to go home.
Точно знала, що будуть діти, що будуть учні. І тому питання навіть і не стояло. Раз відкривається школа в офлайні, раз ми працюємо. Це моя школа, це мої діти, це мої колеги. І я повернулася.
The tide of the war has turned since then. In September, Russia found itself on the back foot, while Ukraine retook thousands of square kilometres. Now, fighting stretches over an 800-kilometre front line, with little movement in either direction.
What you've got now is both sides gearing up for the spring and summer. You've got Russia mobilising and training its extra conscripts. You've also got it reorganising. Now, whether Russia will mount a major strategic offensive is not clear. It may be they will hold their new forces in reserve for counterattack any Ukrainian attacks. But Ukraine has a vote. The Ukrainian military are absolutely clear that this year they want to mount strategic counter-offensives.
It's been a challenging winter for soldiers and civilians alike. Moscow is still firing missiles at major cities, with energy infrastructure its biggest target. Ukrainians live with rolling blackouts, going hours, sometimes days, without power. But the prospect of spring brings some sense of optimism.
Якщо Україна виграє війну, а це буде обов'язково, бо іншого варіанту при цьому типі війни не існує, тому що ключова ціль, про це пан Путін вже неодноразово говорив, є не просто там надбання якихось, придбання якихось територій, додаткових, і не просто руйнування економіки України, а знищення саме концепції, нинішньої концепції української державності.
Yet that concept is now stronger than ever. Ukrainians have rallied around their flag and their government. Many who used to speak Russian by default now consciously switch to Ukrainian. The war has propelled the whole country into action. Every Ukrainian is finding a way to use their skills, and new charities are constantly emerging. The Sergei Petrula Charity Foundation is one of them. It crowdfunds donations to buy military equipment for the country's troops.
We right now know who the Ukrainians, who are we, you know, our identity, what we are struggling for, what we are about. We're about freedom, about development, about future, and Russia is about the past, about problems, about death and destruction.
Projecting that identity to the world has helped the Ukrainian cause. It's a message the government has delivered to many world leaders that Ukraine is fighting a war for not just its own territory, but for Western values themselves. Ukraine's leaders are determined to win this war. They vow that one day air alerts will be silenced and church bells alone will echo across the country. But the path towards that day is as much in Moscow's hands as it is Kyiv's.
Far from the front lines here in Moscow, you have to look quite hard to find any signs that there is a military conflict going on. And that's not by accident. The Kremlin is carefully balancing the need to try to retain a sense of calm and normalcy, while also pressing upon the Russian people that this is a fight for survival, an existential conflict that requires their support. But if you look carefully around the city, you can start to see signs that not everything is the same as it was last year. A normal winter's day in modern Moscow. Young men working, people enjoying themselves, restaurants open. But that's not a McDonald's, that's Vkusny Itochka. And that's not a Starbucks, it's a Stars Coffee. Just two of the American brands that packed up and sold their stores to Russian owners when doing business here became taboo. And this is why. Russia's special military operation against Ukraine. The city's not littered with signs like this, but if you know where to look, you can spot them. The Latin alphabet Z and V were painted on the sides of tanks when they attacked Ukraine a year ago. Now they remind people in Russia to support the Russian military. Outside this ice rink near the Kremlin, I asked people if the military operation has changed their lives.
Конечно, зарплаты, конечно, не уменьшились, это однозначно.
Первично то, что мои дети уехали, наша семья разрушилась. Вот это для меня самое важное, самое главное, что произошло.
Others say their lives have barely changed at all.
Все хорошо, все нормально. Надеемся на свое правительство. Путин, мы его любим, мы его уважаем. Для нас он гордость.
Others are too afraid to speak to us. People can get in a lot of trouble for expressing anti-government positions. Participation in anti-war protests saw thousands fined and hundreds jailed. After years of the Kremlin suppressing political opposition, the closest to public dissent you'll find on an average day is a bouquet of flowers lying at a statue to a Ukrainian poet, or perhaps a blue and yellow ribbon wrapped around a monument to victims of political repression. None will be there for long. But thousands of kilometers from Moscow, in the Siberian city of Novosibirsk, city councillor Anton Katavin has found a little more wiggle room to be critical. He's trying to support those struggling with local issues and the effects of the so-called special military operation without breaking the law. Not an easy task.
It's not a repression for us, it's like everyday life. So, well, yes, I was fined, I was in a political jail, my house was searched one time, but it's sort of fine.
This is life in...
Yes, I think it's life for a politician in Russia.
Every Friday at his constituency office, he hosts a live stream on YouTube to provide advice and answer people's questions. Recently, a local man who admitted to teaching his son pacifism was investigated by Child Protection Services. The families of mobilised men wanted to know how to secure them food and equipment.
Right now, people are coming for me for the same problems that they came for 2020, for the year 2021. It's all the same. But the perspective slowly changed. They ask more questions right now. Maybe our government is not correct. Maybe we are doing something wrong.
Kartavin believes democracy and elections are still the best way to change direction. He says people need alternatives to vote for, despite the risks of being an opposition politician. The thinking of those people is a subject many want to understand both inside and outside Russia. Among them, the independent Levada Center, labelled a foreign agent by authorities. This January, they found 4 in 5 people supported the actions of the president. The researchers say few things have changed that level of support over the past year.
No news about, for example, big losses or some tragedies, or even the cases when Russian army, for example, retreated from Kyiv region. They didn't have much influence on these questions. Support of the military, support of the idea of peace talks, no big changes. But the possible involvement into the conflict, bigger involvement in the conflict of ordinary people, yes, this I think provided the biggest shift.
Denis Volkov predicts future waves of mobilization would be met with less of a reaction. Those in power here say Russians must fight until the Kremlin's vaguely defined goals in Ukraine are achieved. That's led to geopolitical isolation from some parts of the world, but there are still many countries who feel there's something to gain from a Russia desperate to sell energy, in search of new trade routes, and in need of friends and allies.
The war between Russia and Ukraine is happening thousands of miles away, but its effect is being felt across the globe, perhaps nowhere more acutely than here in Africa. The two countries are among the world's top producers of wheat and sunflower oil, which many African countries rely on. A disruption in their supply has worsened an existing food crisis on the continent, with millions of people facing hunger and starvation in 2023, 25 million of them here in Nigeria. Linda Kure is preparing what could be the only meal of the day for her 6 children, a local porridge with milled corn and some vegetables. Rising food prices mean her children are often hungry.
Abinci yayi tsada yanzu. In mun dan fita ko dogo mun dan samu za mu shiga kasuwa sai mu lallaba mu kawo gida. In mun kawo gida ina dafa yara na 7. Nika raba yara biyu mutane 2 a plate guda, mutane 2 a plate guda daya. Sai sannan yaro da ya rage na zan hada ni da shi sai mu ci, sannan abinci ya ishe mu ci.
Like many countries in Africa, Nigeria relies on imports to feed its population. And in 2021, it spent over $200 million on wheat imported from Russia. But that wheat has been in short supply since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. At this market on the outskirts of Nigeria's capital, Abuja, sellers of staples like pasta and bread say prices have shot up by as much as 50% in the last year, with many Nigerians unable to afford them. Merchants here say they see every day how hard it's been for their customers. The United Nations says 25 million people are facing a food crisis this year in Nigeria alone. Terrorism, the effects of climate change and the impact of COVID-19 pandemic are all underlying issues. But disruptions in food supply from Russia and Ukraine have made the crisis more acute.
The clearest line you can draw between the Russian invasion of Ukraine and food price in Nigeria is that Nigeria is an import-dependent country when it comes to food. Nigeria is a net importer of food. So when there is a disruption in that import value chain, it's bound to affect the prices of food and availability of food in Nigeria.
It's a desperate situation for millions of Nigerians displaced by violence in their communities and taking shelter in camps. They rely on food aid from humanitarian organizations, but soaring prices have forced aid organizations to slim down their operations, and they are now unable to provide food every day.
If the war continue, the war between Russia and Ukraine continue, and the food prices continue to increase on this scale,
We cannot be able to feed the number we are feeding now. Before the war, we feed like 5,000. But now, because we have to scale it down and feed maybe just 300.
Children are among the most vulnerable, and feeding them is top priority at this camp in Abuja for the internally displaced. Fatima Abubakar lives here with her 3 children. But finding enough food to eat is not just a Nigerian problem. Uganda hosts more refugees than any country in Africa, and it's struggling to provide food for them. In South Sudan, nearly 8 million people are expected to face hunger this year. In Sudan, grain shipments from Ukraine arrived in early September as part of an initiative brokered by the UN and Turkey to allow a safe corridor for shipping vital grains. The UN says more than 9 million tons have been exported from Ukraine through the Black Sea because of that initiative. But the shipment is still below pre-war levels and prices still remain high for poor Africans. But the war has also sent oil prices skyrocketing. And for countries like Nigeria that depend on imported petroleum products, that means having to pay more to bring the petrol in. And more in turn to transport food to hungry people. Analysts say the Russia-Ukraine war should be a lesson for Nigeria and other African countries to reduce their dependence on imports, especially food.
It calls for us to then re-examine our agri policies, how we carry out these things, and how we can ramp up production of our common staple. You can't just outsource your food security to other countries.
While the war rages in Ukraine, seeds are being planted for a longer-term solution to the food crisis in Africa. The African Development Bank has launched a $1.5 billion loan facility. It's meant to help farmers in 24 African countries boost production and mitigate the food and hunger crisis exacerbated by the war. A crisis that's personal, not political, for millions of people like Linda Kure, who have hungry children and few resources to feed them.
In the US and Europe, the war in Ukraine has had both a personal and political impact. Countries have come together, with heads of state and ordinary citizens offering support. But with the war dragging into its 2nd year, there are still no clear indications of how this conflict will end. A new chapter in their lives, upended by conflict. Lydia Gavrish and her 2-year-old son Maxim fled Dnipro last March, finally finding refuge in the Belgian capital, Brussels. Lydia now lives with her sister and niece, who also escaped Ukraine. In this last year, so much has changed for this family. A new home in a new country with a new language to learn. But there's been no change for their homeland, a country that's still at war.
It's so hard to see you every day. Every day is so hard, but when you know it's so close, your home, for us, difficult.
Lydia often attends rallies at the EU and NATO headquarters in Brussels, urging more assistance for Ukraine and tougher sanctions on Russia. The very issues the foreign ministers inside those buildings regularly discuss. Even after months of fighting, one of Ukraine's biggest supporters still only sees one outcome to the war: Russia defeated.
There's no negotiating your way out of it. There's no tearing Europe apart. There's only losing. That what they start is a losing war, and they will lose it. And I'm worried still that in Europe we have not grasped the concept of Russia losing to the fullest.
Some leaders have pushed for peace talks, but both Ukraine and Russia have preconditions. Kyiv wants Russia to withdraw its troops from Ukraine and to return the regions that it's annexed. while Moscow wants Ukraine to recognise that those newly acquired regions are now Russian-owned, and no sign that either side will budge from their positions. Bill Courtney served as US ambassador to Kazakhstan and Georgia and worked for many years in the US embassy in Moscow.
The battlefield will probably continue to be the arena of competition. Typically, negotiations take place when one or both sides is exhausted on the battlefield and wants to find some other solution, and we just don't see that.
Protracted fighting could lead Western countries to provide even more powerful weaponry. Last month, after weeks of pressure, Germany and the US agreed to send tanks to Ukraine, a major shift in strategy. Now, Kyiv wants fighter jets, a move that allies have been reluctant to endorse, fearing a Kremlin backlash.
The idea of Russia launching a nuclear weapon, for example, Xi Jinping and Narendra Modi, leader of India, have publicly made clear to Putin they would not support that sort of thing, and so Putin has stopped talking about it. So I think there's more comfort now that if we provide even Western combat aircraft, that this would not lead to a irrational, ultra-escalatory reaction by Russia.
Some analysts suggest the Chinese leader could go further, using his ties with the Russian president to influence a break in the deadlock. Meanwhile, in the US, as the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky lobbies policymakers for support, domestic politics may impact year 2 of the conflict. A group of 20 hardline Republicans in the House of Representatives has threatened to block future funding to Ukraine.
You've got 20 people who are trying to boss around 395 people, okay? Ultimately, this is unsustainable, okay? Ultimately, this isn't going to work. But in the meantime, they can make a lot of trouble and make a lot of people mad.
President Biden is determined to maintain unity for Ukraine within US politics and the Western alliance in the year to come. It's been a year of change and upheaval, but one thing has remained the same. Lydia Gavrish still has the same wish she had 12 months ago.
It's not change. All Ukrainians want only one. They were fast finish, and we can back home.
To a homeland forever altered, no matter how long this conflict lasts.